I should thank my co-authors in this, just Tim Herman and Giles and Andrew Harding, a colleague from Clare, and should also thank the mapping unit of the soil mapping unit of Doona, who's provided some of the maps, and Jan Rowland, Craig Liddicoat and Dave Mashmet, I suppose, are involved in that. Just a little bit in soil acidity basics, I suppose. This is different to what Michael was talking about. We're actually talking about acid soils developing in the cropping areas and the grazing areas across the state. And I suppose that the secret really is what we see is that once pHs drop below critical pHs, we start seeing too much aluminium, too much manganese, and which become toxicity problems, and not enough things like the magnesium, calcium, potassium, phosphorus and molybdenum gets tied up. And I suppose around about that sort of pH 6 or pH 5.5 in calcium chloride. Oops, sorry. And some of the causes, I suppose, well known, and the ones that particularly focus on nitrogen fertilisers, particularly some forms, or if nitrogen is not used effectively and efficiently in the soil, we also see nitrate leaching out the bottom of the profile, removal of products, and through, I suppose, improved organic matter in the soil, improved pasture production, you get more build up and more nitrate leaching through that. And these I suppose, are very well understood. Across South Australia, I suppose, if you look at the traditional areas of sort of the high rainfall areas, Kangaroo Island, Mount Lofty Ranges, and parts of the southeast, but we're seeing more and more acid soils develop in I suppose, the high rainfall cropping areas in the mid-north, and the Cleve Hills, Lower Eyre Peninsula starting to show up, and I suppose the map there, I suppose, with the sort of reds and the yellows are sort of the acid-prone areas, but pay attention to the next one, I suppose, which is a predictive map of where we might end up seeing acid soils across the state. And with modern farming, Tim talked about the high yields. We know, high rates of nitrogen fertiliser. When I was a young person a long time ago, and a high rate of nitrogen fertiliser was 20 units. Now we're talking 120. Acidification associated with that. And we sort of predict over the next 10 to 50 years that we'll see acid soils show up in all those sort of red areas on the map, I suppose. And we are now starting to see the odd paddock on York Peninsula, which is traditionally considered alkaline soil, not an issue, show up as having acid soils amongst those areas. So expecting it to increase and expecting it to be, I suppose, an ongoing issue in the foreseeable future in the dryland cropping systems, particularly if the systems keep going like they are in terms of farming systems. We've got quite a bit of data on, I suppose, in the acid-prone areas, what percentage are below pH calcium chloride of 5, which we use as I suppose, an area where yield starts getting affected for the sensitive crops. And you can see, depending which region and where we've done the assessment, that between about 40 and 90% of the soils when we test them are coming back below that desirable pH. On the right-hand column, I suppose, you can also see that when we test the subsurface layer, or the 10 to 20 centimetre layer of the soils, again, we're getting quite high numbers for some of those regions where the soil acidity has crept into the subsoil. And I suppose that's pretty important to recognise. It's much harder to treat once it gets down the profile. And I suppose from our viewpoint as well, very few farmers will actually test their subsoil as well. So they often goes undetected. They don't test for it. And I suppose with our testing, we can certainly pick up, subsurface acidity is actually creeping in as well. And we've got quite a bit of data that Richard Merry in particular produced looking at rates of acidification on the various farming systems, and they sort of range from 50 kilos of lime per hectare per year on low intensity grazing. And I suppose his higher rates are up around about 250 kilos per hectare of lime equivalent per year, where it was sort of more intensive cropping. Now Richard's stuff was all the 70s to the 90s. Since then again we've seen continuous cropping come in more widely, high nitrogen use, and even in sort of pasture system now we're seeing much more nitrogen use. You go into dairies now, they all use nitrogen fertiliser. So we probably need a bit more work on what is the real acidification rate on those more intensive modern systems now. Just one of Richard's examples, I suppose, in the mid-north at Tarlee, 1969 the soil was about pH 7 over an alkaline soil. By 93 it had dropped to below 5, and I suppose you can see how that, I suppose the top 20 centimetres or 30 centimetres has all sort of moved to a much more acid condition. Ironically, this soil is actually quite alkaline in the subsoil, so early on the thought was, this acidification actually may be good for it. But we find that once we've dropped the pH that much, you can get 20-30% yield responses in sensitive crops, I suppose, to things like liming. And we've kept some data on, I suppose, lime use, and if we sort of calculate how much acid-prone land we've got and roughly how much lime we should need to neutralise the acidification on that, we end up with the top line, I suppose, which is the red line. And if we've actually gone around and actually measured through, I suppose, the project with Duna, how much lime is being used around the state, and you can sort of see the dark line underneath. There's a bit of a gap, and we always seem to have this gap. Our lime use seems to go up and down a bit, and when we have more active programs, and I suppose farmers are probably better off financially, they tend to spare more money on lime, but then it will drop away a bit for whatever reason. And I suppose the target for us is to get up to that red line in terms of liming, and then we can sort of say we're breaking even. And if you start looking at what's the cost in terms of production, if we estimate where the surface pH is, and I suppose put some dollar figures on it and some stuff about what they're growing on those, we can come up with that sort of $40 million type thing. And probably, particularly for an NRM conference, it's important to recognise, I suppose, that acidity has implications for soil health. We see a major effect on soil biota, soil nutrition I've talked about, and structure, but it also has a range of implications for other NRM issues. This release of manganese, aluminium, iron has major impacts on water courses in some cases. In Victoria, they've had issues with water courses becoming more acidic. We have low water use efficiency on acid soils, which can link to other NRM issues, whether it's salinity or groundwater erosion, and things like heavy metals. If you acidify the soil, things like cadmium become more plant available than what they were historically. So I suppose getting on to activities, we've had a range of activities through a range of projects, I should add, through GRDC, Duna and various NRM boards, PIRSA and Landcare funding. One of the things we've been trying to do is understand why aren't farmers monitoring their acidity and treating it more quickly, and so what are the barriers? And in some regions, and we've done a range of surveys, I suppose, particularly through Giles' project, so lime sources is often put up as an issue. We've seen issues with pretty well most of the lime quarries. The major use is not agricultural lime, it's for some other use. So they tend to, I can think of one quarry this year's just shut out, so we're not going to have any more ag lime until next year, which makes it pretty hard to treat if you can't actually get it. We have a major loss of when the soda ash plant at Port Adelaide used to be our major supplier of a byproduct lime, and it was very cheap and very good quality. When that closed down, I suppose there was 40,000 tonnes not being produced there anymore, and most of the other quarries doubled their price, I suppose, as well. So, it used to set the floor in the market. Spreading contractors, agronomy is an issue put up sometimes, I suppose, particularly manganese on some certain soils. If you put too much lime out, you create issues, economics. But the main issue, I suppose, out of this tends to be that landholders always raise the cost, which probably tells me it's priority. They've got plenty of things to spend their money on, and if the agriculture is not actually, the acidity is not actually turning all their plants red, it's not, it's not on that list, I suppose. So we've had a range of activities, again, with various partners, many workshops, field days around the state, trials looking at some of the new products around and some of the, I suppose, the lower quality products, and also to look at the subsoil impact. This is one with Tunkilla Landcare Group, funded through the Murray-Darling Basin NRM board, looking at sort of a range of products, and 2 years in now we can actually see responses to the lime, but the lime's only moved in about 2 inches in the soil, so there's an issue down in this soil down to at least 10 centimetres deep, 10 inches deep. So at the moment, with the effect we've had of the lime treatments is only down to 2 inches of that. After 2 years, we are starting to see yield impacts already. Precision pH mapping, which is some technology that's been developed through my colleague Andrew Harding up at Clare, and this, I suppose, the aim of this is really to provide, I suppose, this is actually testing pH as you drive around paddocks, and is a new technique, I suppose, and it gives that ability to fit, I suppose, acid soils treatment into a precision ag approach. So at the end of the day, you end up in a paddock, you will end up with sort of zones within a paddock. And, in this case, you might decide that the orange and the pink zones need to be limed, the yellow zones don't. So you're not putting lime out where it's not needed, you're putting it out where the most acid parts of the paddock are, and in some cases even varying it. And I suppose this technology's, I think it's coming. Oh, no, yeah, 2 minutes. Another example in the southeast where we're basically going from acid to more neutral areas of paddocks. Again, you're not liming the whole paddock. range of tools that have been developed, and including things like a lime cost comparison, comparing liming products, auditing tools for farms, I suppose, and you know, this one you can actually compare the price of different products and what it costs you per hectare to apply it, and I suppose trying to get some new lime sources around the state, and this needs to be agricultural lime, it's not road rubble, it has to be fine enough it's useful. And I suppose all this information basically will hopefully end up in a website link to the AgX website, I suppose, at some stage. That's it.
Sorry, plenty of time for questions.
I thought that was a hint.
Ryan, this is an example of a very well understood process that's going on, right? And yet what we've got is a classic case of market failure, because the cost associated with increasing acidity is being put off for future generations, right? So when do we decide that market failure has to be treated in another way other than just encouraging people?
Well, it costs a lot of money to subsidise lime, but yeah.
Well, maybe you've got to say, look, it's a requirement that you match what you take out of the land with a lime replacement. Maybe it becomes a requirement if nothing else works. Otherwise, you're just putting off the day when there's a huge cost associated with everything else, you know, in terms of production and in terms of, you know, the environmental.
And we do see a range. Like, you know, you've got farmers out there that are liming preventatively, really, before they get a response, you know, and they'll put stuff out because they see it as something they can invest in, through to others that haven't started yet, I suppose. But yeah, it is interesting. But you'll get that range of people, and eventually, I suppose, they'll see what's happening around, and they'll talk about so-and-so's farm, and he just happened to be the one that was liming 25 years ago, you know, is producing more. So it is catching up. But yeah, it's a good question.
What a question. Are there any of these grower networks that you think this message will get good traction with?
Yeah, look, I think a lot of the growers are involved in the various projects, and they're very interested, I'm saying, in the different liming products at the moment. I suppose the website will possibly go to the AgX website, which is linked to all the grower networks in the end. I think probably, you know, we've had good support from the NRM boards through the River Murray and the Adelaide Hills, I suppose, have certainly helped us with various programs as well. And then Eyre Peninsula as well, I suppose, thinking about it. But yeah, the growers, most of the major grower groups have now linked in some capacity, but it's that, there's a couple of little sleepers in this. One is the subsoil stuff no one tests for unless we test it, because farmers just normally test their topsoil. So that's one of the issues. We've really got to try and get them testing more, a bit deeper in the profile, because they can sort of treat the top and the bit underneath still got an issue and still getting worse, I suppose.